All right, Shabbos say good morning, Shechianu, V'kiyamanu, V'higianu, Lazman Hazeh, the great zechus today that we have to begin Meseches Chagigah, an absolute and overwhelming, incredible zechus. So begin by thanking our sponsors for today's shir, to thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Adar Aleph, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating all the shir and drashos this month in memory of Paul's grandparents, Zechariah Ben Zechariah and Dinah Bas Rab Dov. To thank Art and Shari Miller for dedicating all the shir and drashos this month in memory of Art's brother, Richard Miller, Reuven Ben Betzalel Barachal. We also have our week of learning sponsor, also Paul and Kathy Pollack, the first time in shir history that we have a TALMUD TORAH sponsor who's also a weekly sponsor, for dedicating the shiurim this week in honor of Paul's fellow Talmidim on Zoom. Baruch Hashem. Shkayach to our Zoom Chevra. Thank you, Paul, for that sponsorship. Good. And thank you, of course, a week of learning sponsorship to Ayal Steinberg. Thank you to Ayal for sponsoring for the zechus of a refuah sheleimah for Shulamis bas Susha. Have a refuah together with Kol Yisrael, all of the neshamas should have an aliyah, and the families in Echam. And Abosai, with that, let us begin. So we have a really beautiful and incredible daf out of us. First of all, again, there are Daf Yomi notebooks for Meseches Chagigah. As I say at the start of every Masechta, the notebooks are a powerful tool, because the challenge of Daf Yomi, of course, is the power of retention. At least for most of us, that's the challenge of Daf Yomi. We do a lot at a pretty quick pace. The nice part of the notebooks is you could jot down something that jumps out at you, and at least on each daf, to have a nugget. On each daf, to have a little something that's yours, that you retain, that you take with you, is incredibly important. So again, yashikach to our office for preparing those notebooks, and please enjoy. So mostly with that, let us begin. Meseches Chagigah, Daf Beis Amud Aleph. So exciting. You know that new Gemara smell. It might be a few thousand years old, but it's still incredible. So says the Mishnah, Hakol Chayav and Bere'iyah. So we'll say, so remember again a bit of context. Everyone is obligated in the mitzvah of Re'iyah. What is the mitzvah of Re'iyah? Rashi says over here, Hakol Chayav and Bere'iyah. The mitzvahs Re'iyas kol zechurcha. Shetzrichen le'Yisrael's ba'azara Beregal. Rabbi say the pasuk says, this is in Shmos, Perek Chav Gimel pasuk Yud Zayin, Shalosh Pa'amim Bashana, 3 times in the year, Yera'eh Kol Zechurcha Es Pnei Adon Hashem. Every Jewish male shall see the Ribono Shel Olam. Rabbi say the mitzvah of Re'iyah is the mitzvah to appear and to see. It's really, we're going to define it a little bit better, but to appear in the Beis Hamikdash 3 times a year. Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. This is the mitzvah of Re'iyah. It's phrased as the mitzvah to see the Mikdash. But of course, again, I just want to point out, if you stand on a hill, outside of Yerushalayim, looking and seeing the Beis Hamikdash, that's not the mitzvah of Re'iyah. The mitzvah of Re'iyah demands that one sees the Mikdash from inside the Mikdash. This is the mitzvah of Aliyah L'Regel. Sakolchem Bere'iyah. Everyone is obligated in the mitzvah of Re'iyah, except for the people who aren't. Who's not? Chutz, Mecheresh, Shota, the Katan, Tumtum, androgynous, Nashim, Va'avadim, She'ina Mishuchrarim. So let's start to go through this list. Who are the people who are exempted? Cheresh. So we'll define Cheresh, although normally when we see Cheresh, what does that mean? Deaf mute. That's normally what it means. Shota, someone who is deranged. Katan, child. When I say deranged, lacking mental capacity. Katan, child. Tumtum va'adrogenous. Tumtum means someone whose gender is undefined. We'll say not because they're undefined, but because ultimately, again, physically, at the end of the day, it's it's incredible how you have to define these things today, contemporarily. So, right, it's not a person who has gender ambiguity. We're talking about a person who has physical gender ambiguity. In other words, tumtum actually, again, the issue is physically. The way the Gemara defines it is that halacha l'maaseh, there's like a membrane covering the sexual organs, and it's not clear what the gender of the person is. Androgynous is a person who has both male and female reproductive organs. Nashim, women, avodim she'inam mishuchrarim, slaves who are not emancipated. So it's talking about non-Jewish slaves who are not emancipated. Chiger. We'll say again, we're going to go through all of these cases. Chiger is someone who's crippled. Suma, someone who's blind. Vachola, someone who's ill. Zaken, someone who's old. Umi she'ino yochal la'alos b'raglav, or someone who is unable to ascend to Yerushalayim on their own 2 feet. On their own feet. I will say that sounds a lot like chiger, right? Sounds like, so again, we'll get into all of these cases in the Gemara. Ezu katan. So we'll say it's interesting. So the Mishnah chooses to focus on the katan. Who is the katan? I will say, what is the definition of a katan? Now, here's what's interesting about this. See, I will say, you think to yourself, what's the definition of a katan? Like, that's kind of obvious. We've always been speaking about ketanim in halacha, right? What's the definition of a katan? Generally, below bar mitzvah, or right below bar mitzvah. That's the definition of a katan. So what's going on over here? Look at Rashi just a moment. Ezu katan. So we'll say, so again, before we get to this, you're going to see why the Mishnah has to ask this question. Because in the mitzvah of aliyah l'regel, the Torah makes mention of bringing your children. So because of that, I know that children are involved, somehow involved, in the mitzvah of aliyah l'regel. But obviously, again, there must be a certain age. Yet the Mishnah said that ketanim are exempt. So obviously, once the child is over bar bas mitzvah, or I should say bar mitzvah, then obviously he's a gadol, he's obligated. I also know that at a certain age, even though he's below bar mitzvah, is going to be an obligation for his parents to bring him. So what's the age under which the child is not obligated at all? So we'll say this is incredible. Se'ezu katan, kol she'enu yachal lirkov al kseifav shel aviv. So we'll say, what's a katan? It's actually very beautiful. What's a katan? A katan is a child who's so small that he can't even sit on his father's shoulders to go to Yerushalayim. In other words, like a baby. Because when a child is little, he can sit on his father's shoulders and support his own weight. Support his own weight. See, if you're a young child and you can support your own weight by sitting on your father's shoulders, ultimately you're obligated to go ahead and go to Yerushalayim. But a child who is so young that he can't even sit on his father's shoulders, ultimately again is exempt. But that is Yerushalayim. So I'm sorry. So what's a katan? Or who is the katan who is exempt? Kol she'eno yochal lirkov al kseifav shel aviv v'la'alos miyushalayim laharabayis. Any child who's so young that he can't sit on his father's shoulders and go from Yerushalayim to Harabayis. Divrei Beis Shammai. That's Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel or Beis Hillel say, Kol she'ino yochol le'echos biyado shel aviv v'la'alos miyushalayim Harabayis. Supposed to listen to this. So Machlok is Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai says that halacha l'maisa, if the child is so young that he can't sit on his father's shoulders to go up to Harabayis, then such a child is a katan and is exempt ultimately again from aliyah l'regel. Beis Hillel says if the child is so young that he can't hold his father's hand. So you will say Beis Shammai is more machmir because Beis Shammai is saying that even a younger child is going to be chayiv and aliyah l'regel, right? As long as you're old enough to sit on your father's shoulders and go up to Yerushalayim, then you're obligated to do so. Beis Hillel says no, the child has to be able to walk. Has to be able to walk. Now, maybe not walk on his own, but he has to be old enough that he could hold on to his father's hands and go to Yerushalayim. Shene Emar. And I both say, what does Beis Hillel base himself on? Shene Emar. So ultimately, Shalosh Regalim. So I will say, it's interesting. So Beis Hillel makes his drasha based on the fact that what are they called? Right? What are they called? Regalim. Which means what? From Lashon of Regel. That you have to be able to walk. If you can't walk, and I will say, by the way, we're going to see that makes a lot of sense because if you notice, the other exemptions in the Mishnah were who? The crippled person, the person who can't walk. So we see that obviously the ability to walk on your own is a big thing over here. So therefore, again, Beis Hillel applies that same metric or that same standard to the child. I was thinking about this Gemara a little bit. And I think that there's an incredible message in this as well. What does the Mishnah ask? Ezehu katan. What's a katan? And I will say, now, a person could be a biological katan, right? Or a person could be an emotional life katan, right? So, right, a biological katan is someone who's chronologically young. And I'll say, but sometimes in life, people suffer from katnus as well. Sometimes I suffer from immaturity. And sometimes I suffer from stunted growth. And sometimes I don't even realize, but I'm holding myself back. So perhaps the Mishnah is asking a different question as well. Ezehu katan. So in life, what's a sign of katnus? What's a sign of stunted personalistic growth? So the Mishnah gives two answers. Number one was the answer of Beis Shammai. What does Beis Shammai say? Kol she'eino yochel lirkov al kseifav. So Rabbi says a sign of stunted growth is when you don't realize that you sit on the shoulders of others. See, Rabbi says sometimes we think that, look what I've done. Look what I've accomplished. And we don't realize that everything we are is because we sit on the shoulders of others. Because we sit on the shoulders of those, and forget about standing on the shoulders, at least we sit on the shoulders of those who came before us. If you think about it, think about, for many of us, the Mesiras Nefesh that our parents had. Right? Mesiras Nefesh, today it's so different today. Even a generation ago, to raise Jewish children, even a generation ago, to be able to create a frum household, think our Jewish household, think about the Mesiras Nefesh, think about the sacrifice that our parents made. And again, every parent makes sacrifices, and sometimes we forget, it's interesting that the nature of the world is such that everyone sees the problem with their parents, and everyone sees, what my parents did wrong, but do we recognize also the sacrifices my parents made? Because those of us who are parents also know there's no such thing as being a parent without sacrifices. And every generation has its own sacrifices. Do we think about the fact that we sit on the shoulders of our parents? And what about our grandparents? Right? And some of us have very dramatic grandparent stories. Do we recognize the Mesiras Nefesh? Do we recognize the sacrifices that previous generations made? And we sit on their shoulders. So the Mishnah says, Ezehu katan. What's a sign of smallness? Of smallness, right? Of smallness of mind, of smallness of stature, of stunted life growth, when you don't even realize that you sit, when you're unable to sit on the shoulders of others. When you don't recognize that who you are is because you sit on the shoulders of your father. That's Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel says, Ezehu katan. What's the sign of stunted life growth? Right? What's the sign of smallness of life? So what does Beis Hillel say? A child who can't hold the hand of his father. When you think in life that you don't need anyone's help, that you could just do everything on your own. You don't need anyone. You're fully self-reliant, fully independent. You don't need to hold on to anyone's hand. That's a sign of katnus. That's a sign of smallness. Because Rabbi say sometimes what ends up happening is people with an overinflated sense of self and a certain level of self-aggrandizement or overinflated ego think they could go at it alone. And the truth is, no one in life can go at it alone. We all need someone to hold our hand. We all need someone to lean on. We all need someone to support us. Maybe not in the day-to-day. Maybe day-to-day things are fine. But all of us have moments of incredible vulnerability, and all of us have moments of incredible difficulty. And if you don't get used and accustomed to the idea of holding someone's hand to support you in times of need, you get lost. You get lost in the difficulties of life. So a fascinating idea. So therefore, Beis Hillel says, Ezehu katan. What is a sign of life smallness, stunted self-growth? Any person who doesn't acknowledge that you have to hold the hand of someone. You got to find someone to hold their hand in the midst of life. So incredible yisod, incredible machlokes. And they're not really mutually exclusive. If you think about them, at least from a hashkafic perspective, they're very much linked together. What's a sign of diminished life growth? What's a sign, ultimately, again, of stunted personalistic growth? Beis Shammai, if you don't realize that you sit on the shoulders of those who came before you. Beis Hillel, if you don't realize that you need someone to lean on, you need someone to hold their hand. If I don't develop these mindsets in life, unfortunately, I remain a katan. Good, so the Gemara goes on. Or Mishnah goes on. So the Mishnah says, Beis Shammai omrim, hari'iyah shtei kasef, v'chagigah ma. So also we're going to get into this in the Gemara. Beautiful, beautiful Gemaras. We're going to discuss the idea that there are different karbanos when you come up for Aliyah L'Regal. So we'll say, so there is the Olas Re'iyah, which is an Ola. Remember again, an Ola is a carbon that is totally consumed on the Mizbeach. There's also Shalmei Chagigah. So you have to bring an Ola Sriya. So whenever you come to the Beis Din, you have to bring an Ola. There's also Shalmei Chagigah, Shlamim. So remember again, Shlamim Karban, you have, everybody gets a piece. Part of it goes on the Mizbeach, the chest and the thigh go to the Kohen, and the rest of the meat go to the owner. There's a third category of karbanos called Shalmei Simcha. Shalmei Simcha are they're obligatory in that if you want to eat meat, the way you eat meat when you are in Yerushalayim is through Shalmei Simcha. But they're not mandated karbanos like the Olas Re'iyah and the Shalmei Simcha. So now there's a machlokas as to what the minimum value of these karbanos should be. So it says the Gemara, Beishamai Omrim Mishnah, Hari'iyah Shtei Kasef, the carbon Re'iyah has to be Shtei Kasef, 2 pieces of silver, V'chagigah Ma'ah. And the Chagigah only has to be a ma'ah. So if you look at Rashi says, Beishamai Omrim Hari'iyah Shtei Kasef, Gadol Haba Lehiros, when an adult man comes to the Beis HaMikdash to go ahead and literally lihiros, to be seen by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, tzarech lahavi ola, he has to bring an ola, ve'eino pachusa b'shtei kasef, and an ola, right, this olas re'iyah cannot be less than shtei kasef, right, mishtei kasef, shtei ma'os kasef, shein shlish dinar, which is a third of a dinar. Good. Chagigah, next Rashi, Shalmei Chagigah, chayav hayichidim lahavi beragel, diafilin le'b'shili pirkin. So we'll say, so Beishamai therefore says that Allah chalamaisa, the re'iyah is 2 kasef, and the Chagigah is a ma'ah kasef. Beisila Omrim, Beisila says, no, re'iyah ma'ah, the olas re'iyah only has to be 1 ma'ah of kasef, v'chagigah shtei kasef, and the chagigah 2 kasef. So good, machlokes about the value of the chagigah, or I should say the shlamim versus the ola. Beautiful. Again, we'll get into the Gemara where we'll see the definition. Says the Gemara, hakol asuyeba. So we'll say, so always this kind of structure in the Mishnah is always intriguing. Why? Because we'll say, if you notice something very interesting happens, the Mishnah begins by saying, hakol chayavin b're'iyah. Everyone is obligated in re'iyah. Everyone's obligated in re'iyah. So we'll say, so that seems to be a pretty all-inclusive case. And then what does the Mishnah do? What does the Mishnah do? List the exemptions. Right? Everyone is obligated except. Now both sides. Now here's what's interesting. We know this because we've been through a good part of Shas already. So we know that whenever you see the word hakol in the Mishnah, it always comes to include something specific that you might have not otherwise thought on your own. So the Gemara asks over here, hakol asuyemai. So the Mishnah says, hakol chayaven b're'iyah. Everyone is obligated in re'iyah. So who is that coming to include? So we'll say, listen to this. Hakol asuyemai. La'asuyeh mishechetziav eved v'chetziav ben chorin. The will say it's coming to include someone who is a half eved, half ben chorin. Half eved, half ben chorin. So the Gemara says, now both saying, just to understand, how do you have a case like this of half eved, half ben chorin? Very simple, right? Reuven and Shimon both own an eved Kanani, a non-Jewish servant, in partnership. Reuven emancipates his chelek. So Rabbi says, so now what you have is that eved Kanani now is half emancipated, half not emancipated. Now I will say, now here's the problem that creates for this eved Kanani, which is, what happens to an eved Kanani upon emancipation? What happens? He becomes half Jewish. Right? I will say, I just want to point out, it's always interesting. Remember, nowhere else in halacha do you ever have a concept of someone being half Jewish, except by celebrities, right? Nowhere else do you have this concept. Either you're in or you're out. You're in or you're out. So as I said, I just want to point out the exception to this is an eved Kanani, which is actually quite fascinating. What you're going to see is actually an incredible problem for him. So, but again, if one of the partners emancipates their chelek, then ultimately he's half Jewish. Says the Gemara. So watch this. So therefore, again, the Mishnah is positing that when it says hakol chayovin bere'iyah, hakol comes to include chatzi eved, chatzi ben chorin. He's also chayav in re'iyah. Now, why is he chayav in re'iyah? Because at the end of the day, he has a part of him that's Jewish. So the part of him that's Jewish is obligated to go ahead and Kabi Aliyah. Well, it's interesting. The Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh says that the truth is every Jew is a Chatzi Evet, Chatzi Ben Chorin, right? Because there's a part of me that soars, right? There's a part of me that accomplishes so much. And there's a part of me that wants to be so good. And then there's the Chatzi Evet. There's a part of me that's a slave to so many different things in life. And often to things that are not the right things. So we look at Chatzi Evet, Chatzi Ben Chorin sometimes as like, what an interesting anomaly. Says the Lashon HaKadosh, an anomaly. So for many of us, it's our day-to-day lives. In any event, so the Gemara goes on. The Gemara says, Ravina da Amar. What about according to Ravina? According to Ravina, he said, Misha Chatziv Eved v'Chatziv Ben Chorin Patra min Ariyah. So I'll say, according to Ravina holds that halacha l'maisa. Ultimately, I'm going to see this on Daf Dalid, that no, a Chatzi Evet, Chatzi Ben Chorin is not obligated in Riyah. So according to Ravina then, what does the Hakol of the Mishnah come to include? So it comes to include something else. To which the Gemara says, La'asui, interesting case, Chiger b'yom rishon, v'nispashe b'yom sheni. So listen to this case. It comes to include the following case. A person who is crippled on the first day of Yom Tiv, but then is healed on the second day. Watch this. Let's say you have a person who's crippled, and therefore he cannot walk on the first day of Yom Tiv, but Baruch Hashem, he's healed by the second day Yom Tiv. So therefore, again, the Gemara posits that Hakol comes to include that even this person has to be Ola Regel on the second day. To which the Gemara says, one second. Hani chalaman damar kulan tashlumen zelazeh. Elabam da'amar kulan tashlumen derishon Hakol asuyeh. Rabbi say this is incredible. We're going to see all of these machloksim in the coming dapim. Rabbi say, but this is quite fascinating. Let me tell you this outside, then we'll look in Rashi. We'll say there is a fundamental machlokes as to how to look at the 7 days Yom. Let's just take, for example, Sukkos. So we'll say we know that there's a mitzvah of Aliyah l'Regel, right? That we know. The shaila is, what is the nature of the framework of the mitzvah? So what we're going to see is there's two ways to look at the mitzvah. When does the mitzvah of Aliyah l'Regel begin? When does it begin? Right? First day. So we'll say, see, here's the machlokes. Let's say you're not Ola Regel on the first day. Let's say you're not Ola Regel on the first day. So what do you do? Go on the second day. So we'll say, so now here's the shaila. Do we say that each day has its own independent chiyuv? Right? So in other words, the mitzvah starts on the first day. But if you don't do it on the first day, do it on the second day. Because it's also like the mitzvah kind of devolves onto day number 2. Or if you didn't do it the second day, take a while, guess what do you do? Go on the third day. In other words, that kind of the mitzvah begins on the first day, but it's nisgalgel, it kind of rolls onto each subsequent day. Or do we say no? The mitzvah is on the first day. If you don't fulfill the mitzvah on the first day, you could fulfill the first day mitzvah on day number 2. And if you don't fulfill the mitzvah on day number 2, you could fulfill the first day mitzvah on day number 3. And let's say, how do we look at the mitzvah? Is the mitzvah really the first day? It's only on the first day. But if you don't fulfill the first day mitzvah, you could perform it on one of the subsequent days, or that no, the mitzvah rolls day to day. You say to yourself, who cares? It's the same thing. It's not the same thing. Why does it matter? What if you have a guy, in this case Reuven, who was exempt on the first day? He was exempt on day number 1. What's the case of that? He was crippled, right? He couldn't walk on day number 1, but he can walk on day number 2. So this is fascinating. If you say that the real mitzvah is day number 1, and it's day 1 mitzvah that ultimately again descends or rolls on to every subsequent day. Well, if you're exempt on day 1, then what? As they say, ein al male daber. There's nothing more to talk about. You're exempt. You're exempt on day number 1. That's it. You're done. You're out from the mitzvah. If, however, you say that no, the day 1 mitzvah becomes day 2 mitzvah, becomes day 3 mitzvah, then fine. Even though I could not go on day number 1, I can go on day number 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth. Suppose I look at Rashi. Rashi says, so we're going to see that technically speaking, you could bring your karbanos of Yom Tiv all 7 days of Yom Tiv. So we'll say, here's the lashon. Some say the way the days of Yom Tiv work is they're tashlumin zelazeh. Each one could be a makeup for the other. Others say no. The subsequent days are the makeup day for the first. We'll say, here's the lashon. Tashlumin ze lo ze. Each day is a makeup for the other one, which means essentially that the mitzvah kind of evolves from a day 1 mitzvah to a day 2 mitzvah to a day 3 mitzvah, so on and so forth. Or no tashlumin derishon. Each subsequent day is a makeup for day number 1. And says Rashi, my benayu, Iga benayu man damar kulan tzavosa. Again, then Rashi goes on to say that halacha ma'aseh, the nafkamina would be if you're exempt on day number 1. If you're exempt on day number 1, if you hold that every day is tashlum derishon, every day is a makeup for day number 1. Well, if you're exempt day number 1, you're exempt the entirety of Yom Tiv. If you hold tashlum and zeh, then ultimately, again, each day has its own unique obligation. So says the Gemara. So therefore, I will say, so let's get back on track. So the Gemara wanted to say that what is hakol? Hakol chayavim b'regia. What does hakol come to include? Hakol comes to include someone who was crippled on day number 1, but Baruch Hashem healed by day number 2. To tell us that he's chayiv and aliyah l'regel. The Gemara said, well, 1 second. Not everybody agrees with that. Right? In other words, only if you hold what? That each day is tashlum and zeh that there's an obligation for such a person. But if you hold that the days of Yom Tiv are tashlum and derishon, they're all a makeup for the first day, then if you're exempt on day number 1, you're exempt the subsequent days as well. To which Gemara says, fine. Let's find another case. Hakol la'asuyemai. So therefore, we'll say, again, try number 3 now. Attempt number 3. What does hakol chayavim b'reiyah, what does it come to include? La'asuye suma ba'achas me'enav. Let's say fascinating. To include someone who's blind in one eye. Someone who's blind in one eye. The Gemara says that tell us that even someone who's blind in one eye is obligated in aliyah l'regel. Then I will say, watch this. Udulo ki haitana. And this also would not be in accordance with the following opinion. This Sanya, here we go. Yochanan ben Dahavai, Omer Rabbi Yehuda. Yochanan ben Dahavai said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, Suma ba'achas me'inav pater min ha're'iyah. A person who is blind in one eye is pater from aliyah l'regel. Pater from aliyah l'regel. Shene'emar, because the pasuk says, pasuk says, now just to quote to you the pasuk says, Shalosh pa'amim bashana yeira'eh kol zechorcha. But I will say, when you look at that word in the Torah, it could be read as how? Yir'eh. So I will say, so it's Shene'emar yir'eh yeira'eh. I will say, now as you're seeing yir'eh and yeira'eh, yir'eh means what? You will see. Yeira'eh means you will be seen. So the Gemara makes a drush of yir'eh, yeira'eh. You'll see, you'll be seen. Meaning what? Kiderech sheba lir'os, kach ba leir'os. To teach us, I will say the following drasha. The same way that is so beautiful, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to the Beis HaMikdash to be seen by Klal Yisrael during Aliyah L'Regel, the same way that Hashem comes ultimately to see, so He wants to be seen. The same way God comes, Hashem comes to see Klal Yisrael, the same way He comes to see, He wants to be seen by Klal Yisrael. What does that mean? Ma liros b'shtei einav. Just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes and He sees us kiviyachol with 2 eyes, af leiraos b'shtei einav. So too, ultimately, again, He wants to be seen with 2 eyes as well. Which therefore comes to do what? Comes to exclude the person who is blind in one eye from the mitzvah of aliyah l'regel, because he does not see Hashem the way Hashem sees him. So we'll say this is the drasha of yir'eh, yeira'eh. The way Hashem comes to see, Hashem kiviyachol comes to see with 2 eyes, He, quote unquote, demands to be seen with 2 eyes. Therefore, if all I have is 1 eye, I'm blind in 1 eye, I'm exempt from the mitzvah of aliyah l'regel. And I will say, so again, just so you keep track over here. So remember again, the Mishnah, the Gemara is coming to say that hakol chayavim b'reiyah is coming to include this guy who's blind in 1 eye. The Gemara is just saying, not in accordance with this opinion. So apparently, a guy who's blind in 1 eye is a machlokes. Our Mishnah will say he's chayiv. Later on, we'll see Yochanan ben Dahavai, Rabbi Yehuda. He's not chayiv. By the other possibility is well, so maybe let's go back to our original idea. What was our original idea? Both said this is incredible. Our original idea was Ravina. Was Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin, and to teach us that a Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin is chayiv in aliyah l'regel. To which the Gemara says, but one second, we kind of abandoned that approach because of Ravina. Ravina said that a Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin is not chayiv in aliyah l'regel. So the Gemara says, Lo kashya, kan b'mishnah rishona, kan b'mishnah achrona. They both say there are two different versions of the Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin law. An earlier version and a later version. Look at Rashi just a moment. Mishnah Rishona. Kodem shechazru beishamai lahoros kedivrei beis hillel lahoros kedivrei beishamai. Seifa demas nisin diktani chutz min ha'avadim shena mishachrodim. Tukmar Rabbeinu will say, actually before we get to this Rashi, let's see. We'll say we're going to see a fundamental shift in the way the halacha dealt with the Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin. Watch this. Disnan. Misha Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin. Ovid, that's Rabbi Yomechav Asa Yomechav Divrei Beis Hillel. So we'll say originally, Beis Hillel's position was as follows. What do you do with a Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin? So we'll say again, same case as we said before. We'll just call him Eved, right? Eved Kanani is owned by Reuven and Shimon. Reuven emancipates his ownership interest. Shimon does not. The Eved is literally half a free man, half an Eved Kanani. So what does he do? So Beis Hillel says, what's the big deal? He works for his master one day, works for himself one day. Right? So one day he's doing whatever he's doing for the master. The next day he's running his hedge fund, right? He's a Ben Chorin, right? Whatever it is that he's doing. But Lamaisa, his time is split between himself and between his Adon. Amrlan Beis Shammai. So Beis Shammai says to Beis Hillel, Amud Beis will say, Amud Beis, Takantem es Rabo, ves atzmo lo takantem. That's very nice. That's a great setup. You've taken care of his master's issues, right? Because now Shimon, who is the remaining owner, will get 50% of work from the Eved. But the Eved is stuck in the lurch. In other words, the Eved has a real problem. What's the problem of the Eved? So I'll say, here we go. Lisa Shivcha Eino Yochol. He can't marry a Shivcha, right? He can't marry a Shivcha. Why can't he marry a Shivcha, Rabosai? Because at the end of the day, he has a part of him that's free, right? A Jewish man is not permitted to marry a Shivcha. So he can't marry a Shivcha. Bas Chorin Eino Yochol. He can't marry a regular Jewish woman. Why? Because he's half Eved, Libatal. So we'll say, so what does this mean? He just shouldn't get married and try to have a family? V'halo lo nivra olam el l'piriya v'rivya. I will say the world was created for procreation. I will say, what does that mean? In other words, the world was created so that we should try to establish families. We should try to have a normal life. So the idea over here is that this guy is, as they say, nishtahim nishtaher, right? He's nowhere. He's nowhere. He's in this limbo state. He can't marry a shivcha. He can't marry a Jewish woman. So what's going to happen? So the Gemara says, "V'halo lo nivra olam al periv v'shneimar lo so bara l'shaves yitzara." We'll say Hashem didn't create the world to be desolate. In other words, Hashem wants people to get married. Hashem wants people to try to have a family. Hashem wants people to try to build the world. So what do we do? Ella, so we'll say, watch this. Ella, we'll say, this is all Beis Shammai, by the way. It sounds very interesting. All Beis Shammai. Ella, mipnei tikon ha'olam, kolfen es rabo, va'osa osa ben chorin. They both say, listen to this. Beis Shammai advances something amazing. Beis Shammai says, you know what we do with the Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin? We force Shimon, who's the remaining owner, to emancipate his part of the Eved. We force Shimon. We say, listen, Shimon, the world is not served by this type of arrangement. So we force Shimon to emancipate his part. Now watch this. I'm saying, now here's the problem, right? We don't want Shimon to have to take a loss. And we tell now the Eved, you owe the master 50% of your value. So we'll say, here's what's happened. So we force Shimon to emancipate his part, but again, Shimon doesn't deserve to suffer a loss. So we tell the Eved, okay, now you owe 50, you owe your value, so to speak, 50% of your value to your former master. I will say, now obviously that's a good deal for everyone. It's a good deal for Shimon, right? Well, it's a good deal for the Eved. Really, it's primarily a good deal for the Eved. But at least Shimon doesn't suffer a loss. So both say, this is how Beis Shammai chooses to deal with the Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin. Essentially, they said this is an unsustainable model, and therefore, again, by definition, we cannot perpetuate it. And both say, what ended up happening? V'chazru Beis Hillel, the horos k'divrei Beis Shammai. And ultimately, again, this is fascinating. Originally, Beis Hillel disagreed. Right? Originally, Beis Hillel said, no, we're okay with this system. You're 50% Eved, 50% free man. But ultimately, again, Beis Hillel comes around to this new arrangement, and halacha l'maisa agrees with Beis Shammai. Sefer Rabosai, the Gemara wants to suggest that we could go with Ravina's approach, and therefore hakol chayavim b're'iyah comes to include even a chatzi eved chatzi ben chorin. What about Ravina? Ravina said a chatzi eved chatzi ben chorin is not chayv in aliyah l'regel. Yeah, that's in the original form of chatzi eved chatzi ben chorin, where Beis Hillel allowed for this arrangement. But after Beis Hillel agreed with Beis Shammai and said this arrangement is unacceptable, therefore we force the full emancipation of the Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin. Ultimately, again, even Ravina would agree that such an individual is chayiv in Aliyah L'Regel, because essentially such an individual becomes what? A full-fledged Jew. Take a look at go back to just Amud Aleph just for a moment. Just that Rashi. Mishnah Rishona, Kodem Shechazu Beis Hillel, Kodem shechazu Beis Hillel lahoros k'divrei Beis Shammai seifa demasnisin diktani chutz min ha'avadim she'enam mishuchrarim du'ukma Ravina b'mi shechatzi eved chatzi ben chorin depater nishnis kodem shechazu Beis Hillel. Shabbos said when Ravina espoused his position that a chatzi eved chatzi ben chorin is exempt from aliyah l'regel, that was before Beis Hillel changed their position to agree with Beis Shammai. Aval achar shahodu leBeis Shammai sheyesh al Beis Din lakuf es adon l'shachriro. But after Beis Hillel changed their position and agreed with Beis Shammai, and therefore the Beis Din forces the master to emancipate his eved, v'havei ki'ilo meshuchrar kivar. Rabbi say, here's the incredible part. Rabbi say, then we have to go back there. Listen to this. So let's analyze this. So now Ravina says, the Gemara says, Hakol chayavim b'riyah. Everyone is obligated on aliyah l'regel. Right? So who does it come to include? Chatzi eved chatzi ben chorin. Right? Because now everyone's in a, Rabbi say, so let's analyze this just a moment. Chatzi eved chatzi ben chorin in what state? If you're telling me that it's after the Adon, the remaining master, emancipated the last 50%, then is that person chayv in aliyah l'regel? Yeah, of course. Why? He's Jewish. Does the Mishnah need to teach me that? No. So what is the Mishnah coming to teach me? The Mishnah coming to teach me that the guy who is presently a chatzi eved chatzi ben chorin, in this state now, he is now chayv in aliyah l'regel also. Why? Because since we know that he is going to be emancipated, how do we know he's going to be emancipated? Because even Beis Hillel came around to agree with Beis Shammai. And we know that Beis Din is going to force Shimon, the remaining owner, to emancipate his chelik. Since we know he's going to be emancipated, we treat him as what? As emancipated. And we treat him as Jewish, and therefore he is going to be chayiv ultimately in the mitzvah aliyah. So that's the novelty. So you can have a guy who is presently a chatzi eved chatzi ben chorin, but now because everyone is on the same page that such a person is going to be emancipated, we treat him as if he is already emancipated, and therefore be chayav in aliyah l'regel. Absolutely astounding. I will say, just before we go on, I'll just mention something quite beautiful. One of the suggestions that the Gemara floated about who might be chayiv, maybe in aliyah l'regel, ultimately again was the suma va'achas me'inov, someone who is blind in one eye. So I will say there is a beautiful, beautiful insight by the Noam Elimelech. And the Noam Elimelech says there's an incredible metaphorical significance. The Elimelech of Lezhensk. There is a beautiful metaphorical meaning in, so what does it mean to be blind in one eye? So the Rebbe says something so beautiful. He says, Yesh la'adam beis. The Rebbe says a person has two eyes. Ayin echad kedei liros gadlos Hashem yisbarach. Person has to have one eye with which they see the greatness of God. V'ayin echad kedei liros shiflos atzmo. And a person uses one eye to see their own lowliness, humility. One eye focuses on the greatness of God, and one eye focuses on the humility of the self. Umishi yesh lo rak ha'ayin liros gadlos Hashem, ach eino roa shiflos atzmo, pater min ha're'iyah. But someone who only sees, ultimately again, the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but doesn't recognize his own humility, right? Doesn't see his own deficiencies. So there's something missing. Pater min ha're'iyah. Such a person like that is pater from aliyah l'regel. He's not going to be a ben aliyah. Person is not going to grow if all they see is the greatness of Hashem, but don't see their own deficiencies. It's easy to see the greatness of God. Easy to see the greatness of God, right? Because again, the Rebbe Shalom is absolutely magnificent. But true growth, true aliyah l'regel, True growth as a person also comes from seeing what's broken inside of me. No one likes to see their own broken kite, right? No one likes to see their own deficiencies. No one likes to see ultimately, again, kind of what's misfiring and what's not working. But if I'm not brave enough to look at my own quote-unquote lowliness, not lowliness that I'm a bad person, chas v'shalom, but I'm low in certain areas. If I can't see that, if I can't acknowledge that, if I can't embrace that, then I can't work on it. And if I can't work on it, you can see the greatness of God from here until tomorrow. But if you don't use your other eye to see what's broken and what needs work, there's no aliyah l'regel. There's no growth in life. The Kotzker sees this a little bit differently. People say people think Hasidim don't learn Gemara. They just make l'chaims. See, it's not true. It's not true, right? You see, again, all the Rebbes are weighing in on this. Right? So the Kotzker says something beautiful. The Kotzker says, he says a person has two pockets. In one pocket, right? He says pockets. So it means there's two parts to a person. On one hand, I carry with me the mantra, Kala olam nivra bishvili. The entire world was created for me. Kadosh Baruch Hu made the entire world for me. That's my potential. Hashem made this whole world so I can accomplish something great. In my other pocket, what do I carry around? Va'anochi afar ve'efer. I'm nothing. So both say the Kotzker says, Suma ba'achas me'inav is a person who only sees one of these things. If you walk around life, Kala olam nivra bishvili, the entire world was created for me, that creates an unhealthy sense of entitlement, which ultimately yields to an incredible inflated sense of self and an incredible arrogance. If on the other hand, all I walk around with in life is Anochi Afar Ve'efer, look how broken I am, look how low I am, right? Look what a nothing I am, then unfortunately that lack of sense of self leads to nowhere as well. In life you have to have two eyes. You have to have shtei einayim. So therefore, again, the Kotzker says, Suma ba'achas me'inav. If a person is blind in one eye, it means they only see one of these things. Either they only see Kala olam nivra bishvili, unhealthy sense of entitlement, or they only see Anochi afar ve'efer, I'm a nothing, lack of sense of self. In order to be chayiv in aliyah l'regel, in order to grow in life, you have to have shtei einayim. You have to have two eyes. You have to have a healthy sense of self, kol ha'olam nivra bishvili, tempered with a healthy sense of humility, va'anochi afar ve'efer. So again, the Noam Elimelech telling me my two eyes, one eye has to be looking on the greatness of God, and one eye has to be looking on the things I have to work on, the lowliness of man. What do I have to work on? What do I have to do? What do I have to focus on? The Kotzker, one eye has to go ahead and focus on the world is mine. The world is mine. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created this for me to accomplish, but the other eye also has to focus on Anochi Afar Ve'efer. I have to be humble. Once again, work on the things that are broken. If you're blind in any one of the eyes, you're pater from aliyah l'regel. You're not going anywhere in life. You're not going to be, there's no aliyah. But if I have sight in both eyes, no telling what I could accomplish. We'll say, Amadei's two dots. Let's go weiter. Let's finish this up. Says the Gemara, Chutz micheri shot of a cotton. So the Mishnah said, except for a cheri shot of a cotton. So right, these are exempt from aliyah l'regel. So says the Gemara, Katani. We'll say, by the way, it's also nice to have normal sized, right, pages of Gemara, right? This is like, Mamish, don't look at this and start to sweat, right? Because no way you're getting through this. Well, it's nice. You can do a Daf Gemara in 45 minutes. Says, and most people can do a Daf Gemara in 45 minutes. Good. Says the Gemara, Chutz micheri shot of a cotton. So says the Gemara, Katani cherish dum yedeshota the cotton. Now, we're going to focus over here on who is the shota that we're referring to over here. So it says the Gemara, who is the cherish, excuse me. A cherish is someone who is similar to a shota and a katan. How so? Mas shota v'katan delav b'nei deya. Just like a shota and a katan. So what's common denominator between a shota and a katan? They lack mental capacity. Right? A shota, we've spoken this before. A shota, the Gemara defines as someone who's lamba beis hakvaras. He sleeps in the cemetery. He tears his clothing unnecessarily, talks to himself, people talk to him, he doesn't respond back. So that's a shota. The shota lacks mental capacity. A child lacks mental capacity. So we'll say it must be that the chirish we're talking about also doesn't have mental capacity. And therefore we'll say, what does that come to teach us? We'll say, generally when we see the word chirish, Unless otherwise qualified, a cheresh refers to someone who is a deaf mute. A deaf mute. Can't hear and can't speak. And I will say that's why this person is always grouped together with what? With a shota and a katan. Because the assumption is the chashu, cheresh, shota, the katan. The assumption is these people are grouped together because they all lack capacity. So says the Gemara, the Gemara says, So also what we can infer from this is that if you have a person who is able to speak but unable to hear, in other words, he's deaf but he's not mute, or he's mute, right? He hears but he doesn't speak, so he's mute and he's not deaf, chayiv. So we'll say, we assume that if a person has one of these faculties, either speech or hearing, that they do have mental capacity, and therefore, again, would be chayiv and aliyah l'regel. Tanya l'hudu tan rabbanon. So we'll say, we learn this. Hamidaber ve'eno shamea zecheresh. Here we'll say, we learn as follows. Someone is midaber, he speaks, but he doesn't hear. That's a cheresh. Shamea ve'eno midaber. So we'll say, it's a different definition. Here we're saying that a cheresh is someone essentially who is deaf. And shomea ve'eno medaber, someone who's able to hear but doesn't speak, zehu ilaim. Ultimately, such a person is called in halacha an ilaim, a mute. And yet, zeh v'zeh harehin kepikchin l'chol divreim. And I will say again, these individuals are considered to be like a pikeach. A pikeach means what? A person with mental capacity. So you see again, I will say pretty explicit. If you could hear but you can't speak, or if you could speak but you can't hear, as long as you have one of those faculties, then Allah Lamaisi, you are treated like, quote unquote, a typical person. Umimai, how do you know how to give which name to who? Right? The Gemara says that a person who can't hear but can speak is a cheresh. If you're deaf, you're a cheresh. And if you're a mute, you're an ilim. It's very simple. It's a pasuk. Va'ani kecheresh lo eshma uki'ilim lo yiftach piv. Okay, Rabbi say that's pretty straight out. David says in Tehillim, I will be like a cheresh who can't hear and like an ilim who cannot open his mouth. The other possibility is, as people say, ishtakil milule. Both say when a person refers to an ilim, they refer to an ilim as a person whose words were taken away from him. So both say, so just pointing out over here, you see something interesting. You see the idea that cheresh, unqualified, always refers to what? Someone who is deaf and mute. And therefore, again, that's why he's always linked together with shota and katan. Now, you can have other cases where the word cheresh is qualified. Qualified cheresh can mean someone who's what? Who's deaf, but has the ability to speak. But someone who's deaf and has the ability to speak, such a person is considered to be like a pikeach, like a person with total capacity. So therefore, again, the Gemara is just explaining, when we exempt the cheresh from aliyah l'regel, ultimately, again, that person is deaf and mute. So the Gemara goes weiter. Bryce just said that if a person could speak, but he can't hear, or could hear, but he can't speak, he's going to be chayiv in mitzvahs. But we learned medaber ve'eno shomea, shomea ve'eno medaber potter. But we learned elsewhere that if a person could speak but they can't hear, or a person could hear but they can't speak, that they're potter from mitzvahs. Amar Avinu b'Tiem Ra'ava chisur mechshavah chikatani. We'll say here's half to read. We'll say this will conclude. Here's half to read the Mishnah. Hakol chayavim b're'iyah u'b'simcha. Oh. We'll say, watch this. We'll stop over here with this today. I will say, but we're going to see something fascinatingly amazing. We're going to see that halacha l'maisa, there is another piece to this discussion. There is the mitzvah of re'iyah, and there is the mitzvah of simcha, of rejoicing on Yom Tov. And we're going to see that there are certain circumstances in which a person is chayiv in simcha, but maybe pata from Rebbe. So we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up with this tomorrow. Welcome to Maseches Chagigah. Shkoyach. All right, Chevron, have a great Shabbos, everyone. Thank you.